Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Centre for Geopolitics. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brendan Sims. I'm the director of the Centre. I'm delighted to have the second of our speakers on the history of intelligence. We launched, soft launched, so to speak, with the great Christopher Andrew on the last occasion. But this evening we welcome Simon Heffer, Professor Simon Heffer from the University of Buckingham. I first met Simon about 30 years ago at Peterhouse at the History Society when he was still researching his biography of Carlyle. Since then, he's written other notable biographies, in particular one on Enoch Powell, which was widely lauded. But he's also the author of a very, very highly regarded series on late 19th century, early 20th century Britain. And I particularly recommend the book Staring at God, which is really terrific and in places quite traumatic account of how Britain got to grips with the First World War. But for the purposes of this evening and the purposes of the history of intelligence, we're welcoming him to speak on the subject of chips at the Foreign Office, because Simon Heffer is, of course, the editor of the legendary Channon diaries, in their full, unexpurgated form. Simon, the floor is yours.
Brendan, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm very grateful and I'm honoured to be asked to come here and try and follow Chris Andrew, which is a very tough act indeed. For those of you, and I'm sure you're all aware who Chips was, but I'll just remind you, that's him up there in a rather wonderful painting by a man called James Gunn, made in 1939-1940. With his son Paul. Many of you will remember Paul Channon. He became a cabinet minister in Mrs. Thatcher's government. And Chips was born in 1897 in Chicago. He was very proud of his British heritage. His family had originally come from a village in Devon. And Ottery St. Mary, I think, if my memory serves me right. And he was romanticized this attachment very much. In the diaries, he takes his wife, Honor, down to Devon, and they stop in Ottery and look at the church, and he sees a sexton digging a grave in the churchyard and suddenly has raptures that this horny-handed son of toil might be related to him. It's almost the only time that Chips says anything nice about the working classes in his entire 3 volumes. But he came to England after the Great War. He didn't fight in the Great War. He was enlisted through his mother's good offices into the American Red Cross and went to Paris at the end of 1917 and spent the last year of the war as a volunteer for the Red Cross in Paris on a real hardship posting. He lived at the Ritz for that year. And most days, as the diaries tell us, had lunch with duchesses, or on very bad days, comtesses, or on really bad days, vicomtesses. But he was, he met a lot of English officers during that period who were coming to Paris on leave and decided he wanted to become not just British, but English, and as it were, return to his roots. I think it's fair to describe him as a self-hating American, because what comes over in the diaries in the 1920s, long before the period I'm going to be talking about, is his loathing of America. He seems to loathe it because he regards it as a country without history, or at least as a country without what he defines as history. And he defines history as a great antiquity of civilization, which he doesn't think America has. And of course, America lacks the 2 fundamental things that make history wonderful for Chips, which is a royal family and an aristocracy. Whereas he gets all that in England, and he aspires greatly to join the latter, even if he can't quite join the former. However, when he comes to England in the early 20s, he goes to Oxford for 2 years, gets a very bad degree in French, but he meets a lot of people who are going to be very important to him in the rest of his life. Anthony Eden and he are contemporaries. He also meets Prince Paul of Yugoslavia, who's going to become his best friend, and whose reputation he tries to rescue after the unfortunate events of 1941. And he also, most crucially, although he's probably the least well-known name, meets somebody called Hubert Duggan, who is Lord Curzon's stepson. And he meets Curzon through him, and Curzon becomes his model. Curzon is the man, Curzon's then Foreign Secretary, he's the man that Chips wants to become. And Curzon teaches him how to be an English toff. He copies Curzon's mannerisms, he copies his way of speaking, he tries to copy insofar as his limited income at that stage will allow him his lifestyle. Chips in the 20s is sponging off his father. He detests his father, not because there's anything wrong with his father, but just simply because his father is American, which he can't help. He doesn't like his mother much either for the same reason. And yet he lives very royally off them. The Channon family, when it got to America in the, I think, late 18th century, managed to make quite a lot of money. It had a shipping business in Chicago. Now, you will all know, because you've all got geography O-level, that Chicago is not on an ocean, but it did have the Great Lakes next to it, and the Channon shipping line transported people and goods all over the Great Lakes. And Chips's father made a great deal of money, and I think largely at his mother's insistence, bankrolled Chips until he pulled the handle on the fruit machine of life in 1933, and 3 oranges came up, and he married Lady Honor Guinness, daughter of Lord Ivor, who at the time was, I think, the richest man in Ireland and about the 6th or 7th richest man in Great Britain. So it all turned out well, and it allowed him to pursue a career, first of all, as a man of leisure, but then his mother-in-law, Lady Ivor, who was the Member of Parliament somewhat oddly for Southend-on-Sea, the Welk capital of Britain, decided she'd had enough of Southend, which is a much maligned place. It's not as bad as she might have thought it was. And either because she loved her son-in-law very much or didn't love him at all, offered him the chance to succeed her. And he, in 1935, at that general election that Baldwin won, became a Conservative Member of Parliament for Southend-on-Sea in what was effectively a rotten borough, because before Lady Ivor had been the MP, she had succeeded her husband, Lord Ivor, when he had inherited his earldom in 1927. So there's Chips in 1935, aged 38. He's a Member of Parliament. His father-in-law has not only bought him a nice country seat in Essex, which the family still have, but had bought him a modest house in Belgrave Square. Being slightly ironic because he used to lend it to people for wedding receptions, and it would accommodate between 400 and 500 people. So he's not living the life even in the 1930s of a typical Tory MP, but he feels he is destined for greatness. And he is a great gossip. He wouldn't have been a successful diarist if he hadn't been a great gossip. And while he does distill his gossip into his diaries, he also uses it to try and advance his own career, to try and advance the careers of others. But also he is a great collector of information. And his main sources are threefold, really. He has obviously very good political contacts. He has very good contacts in the aristocracy and the royal family, which are very useful to him. He's a great friend of Edward VIII, so that all goes a bit off in December 1936. But until then, he is very much what he calls at the centre of the royal racket. And he also has pretty good contacts in the press, although he comes to dislike the press profoundly because, like some grand dame, he lies about his age. And on his 41st birthday, the Sunday Express rather viciously reveals that he is 41 and not 39, as he'd been telling everybody. He'd lied that he was born 2 years later. But he does get information from the press, and he pools all these sources of information to try and learn what's going on, to share it with us in his diaries. And when eventually he gets onto the lowest rung of the political ladder, to try and help get himself promoted and suggest he is a man of influence. In fact, there's one very key thing you need to know about Chips, which is that he is almost always wrong about everything. And we need to proceed on that basis. And in that way, he is, in fact, a very valuable study for any budding historian, because he does teach us all that not every source is reliable. I don't think, ever really wittingly tells an untruth, but his judgment is so poor that when I was editing the diaries, I found myself again and again writing footnotes that said, well, yes, he may say this, but this is what really happened. And he's all the more entertaining for that, because quite often he sources his information. He says someone in the Foreign Office told him, or one of his royal contacts or aristocratic contacts who'd come back from Germany, and I'm going to concentrate on the period leading up to the outbreak of the Second World War, has told him stuff. Sometimes it's right, quite often it's wrong. But these are people who many historical writers trust. And Chips, as I say, is a great object lesson in not trusting people. He, as I said, he's very much at the centre of things in the immediate period after he's become a Member of Parliament. Not least because within 3 months of his election, George V dies and his great friend Edward VIII becomes king. And Chips, as an American on the make in London, has been taken up by another American on the make in London, Lady Cunard, and is used to infiltrate a third American on the make in London, Mrs. Wallis Simpson, into high society. And he spends much of 1936 doing this. Although, interestingly, dear old Chips, who prides himself on knowing everything, doesn't realise until the middle of October 1936, when he's told, I think by Lady Diana Cooper, that the king is actually hell-bent on marrying Wallis Simpson. He's under the impression that this is just, a jolly bit of leg over, and it will pass, and the king will marry some nice younger daughter of a duke somewhere, or a European princess, and all will be well. And it comes as a profound shock to him in October 1936 that this isn't going to happen. Indeed, one of the revelations that we get from the diary, not until December 1938, he's writing about Tommy Dugdale. Many of you will know about Dugdale. He was the man who did the legendarily honourable resignation over Critchell Down in 1954. He describes Dugdale as the mystery man of the government. He has no opinions. He's not an intriguer. Chips hated people who weren't intriguers because they were useful to him if they did intrigue. Is a good sort, and yet he is the arch informer. He listens, offends no one, and reports all. So, an exceptionally good spy. It was he, I have since found out, who listened in, who tapped all the late king, that's Edward VIII's, private telephone calls at the time of the abdication, and of course reported them all to Baldwin. So I don't think that was generally known until Chips's diaries came out, so that was a useful piece of information, and I can't find anything to say it's not true. But Chips is really easily taken in, and he's easily taken in because he's got very fixed views. He's not an unintelligent man, but he finds it very hard to be capable of objectivism. And he is very affected by the rise of Bolshevism in Europe. And in 1936, he, like many Tory MPs, I think there are about 30 or 40 who went, is invited to the Olympic Games in Berlin. And he uses this both as a demonstration in his diaries of his regard for Nazi Germany, but also to explain why he has a regard for Nazi Germany, and to show us, the reader, 90 years later, how easily taken in he was. He says on the 8th of August 1936 that Germany too is not now communist, is due to Hitler. It's thanks to him that these games go on, that these fates take place. Oh, England, wake up. You in your sloth and conceit are ignorant of the Soviet dangers and will not realise that Germany is fighting our battles. He then says, we went to the British Embassy to a vast reception. And Lady Phipps, the ambassadress, was in England, and her place was taken by Lady Vansittart, her sister. The Vansittarts are notoriously pro-French. He can't stand that. And I hope that the Berlin visit will go some way to neutralise their prejudice. I think it has. Van, talking to me at the Opera House banquet, admitted to being impressed by the Nazi regime and the way it had transformed Berlin and rejuvenated the country. Needless to say, there's no hint of that in Van Sittart's excellent memoirs that he published 20 years later. A couple of days later, he gives an example of how easily taken in he is. He says, we returned to Berlin and changed into grey clothes, and at 4 o'clock, Vussov and a colonel, Vussov is a man who's been deputed to look after them, and a colonel somebody fetched us and drove us to the country to inspect a labour camp. We'd been told such tales of the hardships labour camps entailed, etc. Now, it never occurs to Chips that this labour camp has been denuded of its real inmates, who have been replaced by junior Wehrmacht soldiers or SS soldiers put in their uniforms, and they're all behaving themselves. He says, not at all. The camps look tidy, even gay. He uses the word in the original sense. And the boys, all about 18, look like the ordinary German peasant boy, fair, healthy, and sunburned, so obviously members of the Hitler Jugend. They are taught the preliminary military drills, gardening, etc., and their health and strength are built up. They were all smiling and clean, so obviously not real inmates. And we saw the men's room, dormitories, baths, etc. As we left, the guard was changed over. 4 boys carrying spades took the place of 4 other boys. For 6 months they live there, and all classes are mixed, which is an excellent system. Its purpose is to wipe out class feeling, which has become practically non-existent in Germany. England could learn many a lesson from Nazi Germany. I cannot understand the English dislike and suspicion of the Nazi regime. Personally, I believe, and it rends my heart to say so, that England is in the retrograde. Something of the old spirit is withering, and what is coming in its place is not exactly pleasant. I hope that I'm not in at the kill. He then gives himself away the next day. He says, in Germany the joys are simple, sun and water bathing, Wurst and beer, all pleasant, all attainable for little. What a country. It stirs me so sharply, and I wonder why. Is it a reaction against my mother's mad francophilia? And I so battle anything that suggests that person to me. I've hated her so deeply all my life. He says, and there are other reasons for my preference for Teutonic races. I loathe Latins, and Slavs are too Bolshevist. There's a common blood affinity between us and the Germans and Austrians. I like their lusty, warm-blooded love of country, children, dogs, power, and 1,000 other reasons. So you see how totally taken in he is by it. He is, we bandy in these times the term racist around, I think, rather casually. This is a man who is a genuine racist. There's absolutely no question about it. And he has an idea of racial superiority. And this is why he loves the Germans so much. He goes that night to a party given by the Ribbentrops. And he says, we were received by EDCs and led up to the Ribbentrops, who received graciously and thanked people for their congratulations for his appointment to London as ambassador. No one quite knows why he has been selected by Hitler to go to London. Is it because his power is waning? Have the machinations of his jealous colleagues led to his disguised banishment to an embassy abroad? Is it because London is considered so important a post that their best man must be sent? Or is it simply that there was really no one else? Now, that also shows one of the dangers of Chips. There were a lot of people in London who, knowing his contacts, when he went back and he said all this to them in the House of Commons, they will all have thought that, gosh, this is really terrific inside information. It took some time to sink in that he was wrong about everything. I think it didn't really sink in until probably after the war had started. He says of the Ribbentrop Party, there were many MPs present. One of them, Lindsay, suggests the formation of a small pro-German or Friends of Germany group in the House of Commons to meet and discuss and offset the Franco-maniacs who are so dangerous to the peace of Europe. We stayed on at the party till 3 a.m. The lovely evening, the fantastic collection of nationalities, the sharpness of the situation, the excellence of Ambassador, or more accurately, Frau von Ribbentrop's champagne, all went somewhat to my head. Berlin is a tonic, a stimulus, and a revelation. His final rant in the Olympic Games is for the closing ceremony. And again, this shows just what an unreliable witness he is over the next couple of years when he's trying to weigh up what the Germans are or aren't doing in relation to us and the whole European situation. He says, Hitler rose, the great torch faded out, the crowd 140,000 strong sang Deutschland über alles with arms uplifted. There was a shout, a speech or two, night fell, and the Olympic Games, the great German display of power and bid for recognition, was over. Mankind has never staged anything so terrific or so impressive. And I couldn't help thinking, as Hitler alone supreme took the salute in the great arena of the Emperor Claudius and his cruel games. Was it possible, would the little man from Braunau, for all his genius, remain simple and unspoilt, while the world and its kings feared and fawned upon him? So that's what we're dealing with. 2 years later, well actually just under 2 years later, March 1938, Rab Butler appoints him his parliamentary private secretary. You will know, of course, that Butler had now been appointed the man who would speak for the Foreign Office in the House of Commons, because Eden had resigned the previous month over talks with the Italians as Foreign Secretary. Lord Halifax, who by coincidence was Chips's uncle by marriage, he had married Lady Ivor's sister, is Foreign Secretary, and Rab becomes the man who speaks to the Foreign Office in the House of Commons. And everyone is rather astonished when Chips, who's been in the House for 2.5 years by then, and he's become viewed really as almost the works canteen of the Parliamentary Conservative Party. He's got this palace in Belgrave Square, and he's very keen to be friends with people who he thinks he approves of. And so he asks many Tory MPs, most lunches or most evenings, back to his house, give them slap-up lunches and dinners, and to ingratiate himself with them in the hope that this will get back and it will show him one day to be capable of being promoted. But they are so used to Chips being a sort of catering officer of the Tory party that they can't quite understand he's been given a quite serious job as PPS to the de facto Foreign Secretary. And Rab, of course, when asked about this, says, well, if one's travelling on a train journey, it's always good to attach a restaurant car. So he knows exactly what Chips is there for. Anyway, Chips gets frightfully excited because this is now his moment where he can really know, or so he thinks, really know what's going on. On the 8th of March 1938, he says, I was given a key to the red boxes. Now I can read all the papers and read all the confidential telegrams. He loves getting secrets. He loves owning information that he can share with others. I am relieved that the FO is not so opposed to Franco as I had feared. They are well aware of the tricks of Republican Spain. Halifax has sent telegrams to France, such as that country has not had since Napoleon. It will make them sit up. And his first few days there, he can't stop reading these confidential telegrams. He absolutely loves soaking it up. 10th of March, all morning at the FO reading confidential telegrams. I met many of the FO. Derek Hoyer Miller, who was married to Bunchy van Svinderen, an old friend of mine, a chap called Catcher, and the sinister socialistic Oliver Harvey, who were the 3 private secretaries to Lord Halifax. I hope by intrigue to be rid of Oliver Harvey. If ever the legation at Helsingfors, Helsinki, should become vacant, he would be an excellent minister, and there he must go. This is another reason why Chips likes to have information, because knowledge is power, we all know that. But he is especially conscious of this, and he feels if he is privy to all the secrets, he can use this to influence those who have the real power of patronage to fire people he doesn't like. Of course, he fails completely. Anyway, the next day, he says that it's an unbelievable day because Hitler took Vienna. The morning was calm, the PM's Chamberlain was enchanting. Chips is in love with Chamberlain, by the way, not in that sense. Chamberlain wasn't like that, Chips was, but he's completely devoted to him. He says, I'm in and out of his room constantly now. There were messages on the tape announcing the mysterious movements of troops in Bavaria. There were denials from Berlin and ominous reports. I'd heard some of them at the FO before lunch. This is him in his element. He's been in the FO for 3 days, and this has happened, and he's first with the news, and he absolutely loves this. There was a grand luncheon party at 10 Downing Street. The Chamberlains entertained the Ribbentrops, Halifaxes, Winston Churchills, and to balance them, the Londonderries, Hawes, Inskips, etc. By then, the news had reached the FO that the Germans had invaded Austria. From 5 to 7 p.m, more messages poured in. I was in Halifax's room at 7:30 when the telephone rang. The Germans are in Vienna, he said, and 5 minutes later, the skies are black with Nazi planes. We stood breathless in the Secretary of State's room, wondering what would happen next. It was like 1914, perhaps more dramatic and less dangerous. All night, messages flowed in. By midnight, Austria was a German province. Now, here we go to Chips's brilliant judgment. He says, I am secretly half pleased and also half relieved, for although it will mean a setback in the Chamberlain government, it must eventually bring peace to Europe. The thorny question is out of the way, but will my adorable Austria become Nazi-led? Well, there you are. Today, this is the next day, was to have been the plebiscite organised by Schuschnigg, late dictator of Austria. He arranged it unfairly and left Hitler no alternative but to sweep in. Yet the world, unaware that Austria is half Nazi, is shocked and aghast. Czechoslovakia will be next, and other parrot cries are heard everywhere. Hitler had cruised into Austria and slept at Linz. Telegrams tell of his rapturous reception. Secret. The French are cheating more than ever with regard to Spain and are sending in large quantities of men and munitions. So he's now become a character in his own soap opera, and that is the great value of intelligence to him, that he's got a permanent script to read. He does occasionally pick up interesting pieces of information. One is from his friend Lady Chamberlain, the widow of Sir Austin Chamberlain. Austin Chamberlain died the previous year. This is April 1938. She's a great Italophile, and everyone is obsessed with what Mussolini's up to and whether he's going to get into bed with Hitler properly. And on the 27th of April 38, she rings Chips up. Says, she called me and we had an enthralling chat for an hour. She's outraged with Anthony Eden, whom she'd looked upon as Austin's protégé. Anthony had several times assured her that he was eager, indeed had already begun to open negotiations with Italy. As she left for Italy in December, she saw him, and he was polite and told her of his aims. And she left about December the 10th for Rome. She saw Mussolini, who immediately sent for her, and later she wrote a full account of her interview with Mussolini to Eden, who replied in his own hand. By the way, that account ties in very much with what she told Chips. She assumed that the talks were proceeding. Later she went to Sicily, and on her return in early February, she again had an interview with Mussolini, at which Ciano was present. They pressed upon her the urgency of a rapprochement between Italy and England. She was surprised. Had it not begun? No. Nothing was even started. Anthony had blocked the negotiations at the start. He would not recognise the conquest of Abyssinia until Italy had withdrawn her volunteers from Spain. Italy would not withdraw her volunteers until we recognised Abyssinia, an impasse. The Duce begged her to do something and named 5 points on which he thought a settlement could be reached. Cleverly, she insisted Ciano wrote them up for her. He had driven her to the Chigi Palace, and there they worked out a formula, which she immediately dispatched to her brother-in-law, the Prime Minister, who discovered that the Foreign Office was not carrying out his instructions, and the fat was in the fire. That's a very good example of how the pre-war world actually worked. Lady Chamberlain's letter, dictated by Ciano, which was an Italian plea for peace, was referred to by Eden and by Cranbourne as blackmail, as gangsters' methods. From that moment, for the next few days, communication between Rome and 10 Downing Street was direct, and Anthony, scrambled, overridden, was forced to resign. Lady Chamberlain blames Anthony for the muddle we're in, blames him for everything. He got out of hand, especially after Austin Chamberlain died, and the change in regime at number 10 occurred at the same moment. He could not tolerate the Prime Minister's supervision after Baldwin's lazy indifference, much that she told me is highly confidential. Of course, she sent the famous telegram to Neville, or to be more accurate, she sent him another telegram to the effect that Grandi had had his instructions and they were satisfactory. So that's a rare example, but a good example, of Chips's political stroke aristocratic contacts, people that he meets in society who come to trust him. Although he doesn't like women very much, I don't mean that in a sexual sense, although that was also true, but although he doesn't like women very much, women are very good at trusting him and taking him into their confidence, and Lady Chamberlain did that rather well. He does become very close to Neville Chamberlain insofar as the PPS can, and the diaries are littered throughout the spring and summer of 1938 with various stories which turn out to be reasonably accurate, or indeed almost totally accurate. He knows when Henlein in May 38 comes to London and has lunch with Winston Churchill at a supposedly secret meeting. Chamberlain debriefs him later the same month, or he debriefs Chamberlain later the same month, on how Chamberlain feels pro-Italian. Chips says pro-German. I would dispute that from having read Chamberlain's correspondence. But he says he doesn't like the Japs, and Chips gets some idea from Chamberlain that the Japanese could be a terrible threat to the British Empire. But for all his new contacts at the Foreign Office, for all this reading of telegrams, he still remains highly dependent on other sources for information. On the 21st of May, when he's been in the Foreign Office all day and reading those telegrams, he says, "I bought an evening newspaper and read of troop movements in Germany, in Czechoslovakia. It sounds ominous. Is it to be Austria all over again?" Well, of course it was to be, but not for another 4 months. Ringing up the Foreign Office, I was told that they were working at full speed. He only just left about 10 minutes earlier. There's a crisis, and I heard that Lord Halifax was also here at Oxford, attending an All Souls dinner. That's right, he'd gone to Oxford for dinner. Left hurriedly for London. I was tempted to go back too, but thought I should look ridiculous. I'm just apprehensive. But he says on the 21st of May, "Will it be a war? And we, as always, on the wrong side. The Sudeten Germans are justified in their demands and aspirations." I went to bed at 11, worn out, but not to sleep. What European coup will occur during the night? Well, there is this great drama in the fourth week of May 1938 about whether something is immediately going to happen. And it shows the Foreign Office is just as susceptible to getting misinformation as Chips is. He said, "I saw the telegrams," this is the 22nd of May, "that Halifax sent to both Germany and France, and the ones to Prague. To Germany, he hinted that in the event of a war, which could only please and benefit those who wished the extermination of civilization, England might not be able to keep out. In other words, between the lines, he was warning Germany that if she attacked Czechoslovakia, we might go to the immediate assistance of France." This telegram had a sobering effect in Germany, particularly on Ribbentrop, who had been churlish and violent. He had a scene with Neville Henderson, that's our ambassador, yesterday. To Prague, Halifax telephoned, urging restraint and advising the Czech government to do everything possible to meet the demands of the Sudeten Deutsch, and thus, while acting firstly individually, they would rob the Germans of a pretext for marching in. To France was a firm reminder that we would not follow her into the cataclysm of a war. She could fight alone. This is Metternich's poker. I pray to God that it will win. And already tonight the atmosphere as the hours pass is calmer. To both Germany and France we have said hold back. Henderson, like Disraeli, has ordered a sleeping carriage to take him from Berlin. He then goes on to say that Halifax is secretly working to detach France from her Czechoslovak alliance. I saw his telegrams to France along these lines. Again, this turns out to be reasonably accurate information. But later on, as the Munich crisis nears, he can't quite believe, after a quiet June and July, that things are going to get worse. He writes on the 25th of July 1938 that R.H. Haddo, the red-haired eccentric at the Foreign Office, is a male Cassandra. He told me again today, for the 20th time, that we're headed for a war in the first week in September. He's violently anti-Czech, as is everyone who knows the filthy country. A very great moment of objectivity there by Chips. He doesn't write very much over the summer because he's disporting himself and trying also to keep track of his wife, who is running off with various ski instructors at the time. just to show you how bad Chips's grasp of intelligence was, he didn't realise his wife was having a series of affairs with ski instructors, even when she went on a skiing holiday to the Alps in July. And there is in the marvellous photo albums at Kelvedon a photograph of her and her sister Patsy, who later became Alan Lennox Boyd's wife, standing on an Alp with a piece of snow about the size of this table, where they must have got very bored skiing, is all I can say. But this was sent to Chips, I think, in order to reassure him that that's what she was really doing. But he goes, having been told by Haddo there's going to be a war, and it's going to start in early September. On the 5th of September, it hasn't started, but Haddo is still in a frenzy of fear in the Foreign Office and tells Chips the Great War, as he calls it, will begin on September the 12th, a week from today. By that stage, Chips is in Geneva. He's gone to Geneva not on official business, though he is obviously a PPS. He's gone there more for a laugh and to meet up with Rab Butler, who's eventually turning up to do something serious at the League of Nations. But when he gets there, a lot of his chums are there, notably Lady Diana Cooper, who's set herself up as a great hostess in Geneva. And he says, we went to the League building, which is a vast affair, a huge, modern, white, dignified, lavish, attractive, empty, expensive palace, as befits the meeting place of 47 nations. 57 nations in theory, but in reality it's really only an anti-dictator club or an anti-German organisation. The bars and lobbies of the League building are full of Russians and Jews who intrigue and dominate the press. They all spread rumours of an approaching war, but I don't believe them. Not with Neville at the helm, he will wriggle out somehow. I fast forward now to the day before the aforementioned Neville gets on the plane to Munich. He says he goes to the House of Commons. He's returned from Europe, where he's still been on holiday in Switzerland, and he's desperate to get to the Commons for the statement that Chamberlain's going to make that afternoon, 28th of September. He gets there early. He said, I wanted to be sure of my place on the PPS bench, and was told as I came in by Stuart Russell, who's a Foreign Office official, that all was not over, that we were still in communication, at least with Hitler, although Sir Horace Wilson's flight had been a failure. Wilson had gone a couple of days earlier. I was then told by the Foreign Office people that the PM had sent an SOS message as a last resort to save the world to both Mussolini and to Hitler this morning. No reply had yet come. The solemn House, unaware of the latest démarche, Chips of course is aware because he's the ultimate insider, or that's how he sees himself, filled every seat, and everyone was aware of the momentous hour. The gravity of the situation was beyond anything perhaps the House had ever known. This is the famous occasion where I think it's Sir John Simon passes Chamberlain a note during his statement, which was theatrically orchestrated, and Chamberlain suddenly says, actually, I've heard from the Führer, and I'm getting on the next plane from Heston to Munich, and all will be well. On the 30th, on the evening that Chamberlain gets back, where he makes the two unfortunate mistakes of going onto the balcony at Buckingham Palace and waving the piece of paper out of a window in Downing Street, something he told his sister 3 days later he regretted because the whole thing had gone to his head, as he put it. He says that Alan Lennox Boyd had met Lord Halifax in the park and had a word with him and congratulated him on the great success, the triumph of Chamberlain, and his, Halifax's, share. Lord Halifax replied that all the credit was Neville's. His admiration for him surpassed all bounds. He added, however, that he foresaw political trouble ahead, both in Parliament and the country. Chips can't understand this. He says, why? We have a wonderful weapon. We can go to the country, he's expecting an election that autumn, and be returned with an overwhelming mandate. Perhaps, I don't altogether deny the possibility, we shall. Somehow I suspect that Chamberlain will first liquidate the Spanish trouble and bring to a triumphant conclusion his four-power pact. He has always been secretly working for this. Now, the gilt comes off the gingerbread pretty quickly, and one of Chips's main sources of what's going on in Germany is Prince Fritzi, the Crown Prince of Prussia. Chips has got this insane fantasy that Hitler is going to recognise the Hohenzollerns' natural ability to rule and is going to hand over to them. I'm not making this up. He's also very affected by the fact that Fritzi, who is a great friend of his, is very anti-Hitler. Fritzi tells him at the end of October 1938 that he had been terrified of war. He said all Germany had feared it. The army and the Potsdam group are averse to it and are growing increasingly hostile to the Hitler regime. The regime more than the man. Himmler and Ribbentrop, this is according to Fritzi, are the dangers. Fritzi is laying siege, a slow-waiting siege, to the throne. We shall live to see him emperor. I've always said so, and have worked for the restoration of the Hohenzollern dynasty. Fritzi thinks the Nazi leaders will eventually devour one another, and then there will be a coup d'etat by the army, which, while not breaking with the Nazis completely, will restore the dynasty and the old Junker regime. Fritzi had to rush back to London to have tea with Queen Mary, who dotes on him. He has been working and has succeeded in once more establishing good relations between her and his grandfather. The exile at Dawn now writes regularly to Queen Mary and to his old uncle, the Duke of Connaught. They're in the twilight of their lives, and it's pleasant that between them at least there is no more war bitterness. The Kaiser told Fritzi only last week that he is still haunted by the fate which befell the Tsar and his family. He'd sent the Tsar a telegram offering him a free and protected passage through Germany, or an escort of battleships had he wished to escape by sea. This was at the moment when the Tsar had tried to get to England. That's, I think, all true. The next bit isn't. He says it was Lloyd George who spoilt and stopped everything, and the late king had been weak with him, thinking the danger not immediate. Their responsibility in the matter has been like a millstone hanging on the necks of both Queen Mary and King George. Their failure to help their poor Russian relations in the hour of danger is the one blot on their lives. Of late, Queen Mary has been sorely conscience-stricken. Those of you who know the true story will know that Lloyd George was very much in favour of the Romanovs coming to England. And it was Stamfordham, George V's private secretary, whose papers at Windsor, if you've ever had the amusement of going to look at them, are full of cuttings from revolutionary newspapers of the time, English language ones, saying that if the Tsar came here, they would capture him and hang him from a lamppost. And what Stamfordham feared was if George V facilitated that, he too would be captured and hanged from a lamppost. After Kristallnacht in November 1938, it slowly dawns on Chips that he might have got the Nazis a bit wrong. He says the secret telegrams, which he's still reading assiduously and taking obviously quite little in from them, too, do not give a very roseate account of Hitler's present attitude. He's becoming increasingly morose and anti-English generally. He quite likes Chamberlain, but thinks we are in a finished race. He's right, of course. We shall be a second Holland in time, but the Dominions are still full of vigour. What he's picking up is something that Chamberlain said to his closest associates on the weekend after he got back from Munich. He made it quite clear to the service ministers and to the chiefs of staff on the Saturday, the day after he got back from Munich, as many of you will know, that rearmament not only had to continue, it had to be stepped up. He was actually under no illusions about Hitler. He said something in public which he almost instantly regretted about peace in our time. And he said, we've got to spend more money. He told Sir John Simon, the Chancellor, this. We've got to spend more money on arms, and we've got to do it quickly, because I don't know how long this man is going to behave himself. In fact, Chamberlain wrote to his sisters. All the best things we know about Chamberlain come from letters to his sisters. He wrote to his sisters in July 1934, after the Night of the Long Knives, saying that Hitler was a monster and it was terrible that we would have to deal with such a man. And I don't think that opinion ever really left him. By December, Chips writes that Chamberlain's very in the dumps. He says, I've never known him so tired and depressed. He seemed quite miserable, and the smile he gave was very phony. The spirits of the Edenites and Churchillians rose, and Dunglass, that's later Sir Alec Douglas, or Lord Hume, later Sir Alec Douglas Hume, his private secretary, looked miserable. Later, Dunglass cornered Rab and Geoffrey Lloyd for an hour and asked their help and advice. So Chamberlain's aware by December 1938, Chips isn't, that the wheels are coming off the Great Peace Project. And this is not least despite the fact that in January, of course, he goes to Rome and sees Mussolini and tries and fails to get Mussolini on side against Hitler. When he goes to Rome, Chips goes to his desk in the Foreign Office and he says, that's the Foreign Office, that's the ministers there, were still without real news of the Rome visit. And Chamberlain had been there 2 days by that stage. And what they knew about Rome was not what they'd been told by anyone in the Foreign Office, it was what they'd read in the newspapers. But the general impression is that it has not exactly come off, although, I don't know what his authority for saying this is, it improved our relations with that fascinating and important power. Of course, the minute that he gets back from Rome, he says of Chamberlain, his status is enhanced, his prestige increased. He is winning through and will probably be premier for years to come. I shall try and cease giving you endless examples of Chips's brilliant foresight on these matters. Again, the Foreign Office is pretty slow on the uptake when the annexation of the Czech lands takes place in March 1939. You will read in some places that there were indications of this a week or so earlier because of troop movements. That may well be the case, but they certainly didn't percolate through to the Foreign Office. It's not until the 14th of March that he says there were rumblings at the Foreign Office of renewed trouble in Czechoslovakia. We didn't at first take them very seriously, but learned that the Czech government had resigned and that Hitler had summoned the president to Berlin. It looks as if he is going to break the Munich agreement and throw Chamberlain over and become an international gangster. When this happens, 24 hours later, he writes that the event of it, the manner of it, surpasses comprehension. And Hitler's callous desertion of the Prime Minister is stupefying. I could never forgive him for making his enemies become both prophets and right. It's a great day for the socialists and for the Edenites. The PM is discouraged and horrified. Now, it's probably understandable that Chips, who is so blind to reality and is still, despite certain modifications, under the impression that the Germans are reasonable people, or the Nazis are reasonable people. It's not surprising that someone with such limited grasp of the situation as he has, even though he has this privileged position in the Foreign Office, should think these things. But apparently Butler thought them as well. He says Rab is in a rage too with recent events, indignant at Hitler's methods rather than with his accomplishments. And he said rightly enough that the Drang nach Osten, which his new policy seemed to indicate, was a relief, a disguised blessing to the empire. Hitler was going towards the east instead of snarling at us. I agreed and deplore the senseless hysteria. The cabinet sat, and I'm told they were like a lot of angry, frustrated hens. Certainly if you read the cabinet secretary's account of that meeting, they weren't happy. Before we get on to the outbreak of war itself, and I must shut up in a minute, but before we get on to that, there's a prime example of Chips's high society contacts leading him to pass on information which was absolute rubbish. On the 18th of March, so 4 days after the annexation of the Czech lands, he writes, Princess Martha Bibesco, a famous mondaine, exotic writer and amoureuse. She was the mistress of Lord Thompson and later wrote his biography after he was killed in the R101 disaster. She has told Chips that she knew that King Carol of Romania had had an ultimatum from the German government saying that they would invade Romania. How could she get the news to the English government? She knew no one. He and his friend Rob Bernays, another Tory MP who heard this, they believed her, not realising that the ordinary channels existed for carrying such information were it true. Well, he doesn't trust the ordinary channels. Bernays rushed to a call box and frantically poured out the tale to Walter Elliot, who immediately rang up Oliver Stanley at the Foreign Office. Stanley, knowing nothing, sent for Tilia, the Romanian minister, who was Martha Bibesco's tool, her appointee, and probably, although not certainly, her lover. Tillier, perhaps in the plot, was guarded, and thinking that the FO either knew too much or too little, led them to believe the Bibesco romance. He seemed to acquiesce, at least not to deny her fabrication. Number 10 was informed. It's at this stage, Chips doesn't say so, that he begins to realise there might be something wrong with this story. Cabinet ministers cancelled their weekend plans, and this evening there was a cabinet call to consider the emergency situation which had arisen. Were we to guarantee the Romanian oil fields her frontiers against German aggression? Meanwhile, late this afternoon, a message came from Sir R. Hoare, our minister at Bucharest, saying nothing was known in Romania of such an ultimatum. That is the bald truth. But it's midnight now, and this country believes what it has read in the evening newspaper and has gone to bed hating Germany more than ever and resigned to the inevitability of war. Chips, of course, doesn't refer back to the fact that he was taken in by this. It's taken me all evening to piece this tale together. I've rung the Foreign Office, I've talked with both Loxley, a Foreign Office official, and the resident clerks, and I've had 3 telephone conversations with Bernays, who himself admitted that Bibesco was wrong. He defends himself by saying it was his duty to warn the government. Perhaps it was, but he's made us ridiculous in the eyes of Europe. I fear. I shall send in a secret report to the PM of this shady story. He loves sending in secret reports to the Prime Minister, and they almost inevitably avoided any mention of himself unless he was boasting about something that he'd done well. Anything where he'd been involved, and he was involved with this, and he did egg Bernays on to put this ludicrous story through, he keeps very quiet about. He ends by saying, now we have begun to flirt with Russia. We must be in very low water indeed to have to do that. He shows over the next few months that the Foreign Office failed to know anything about the Italian move into Albania on Good Friday 1939. He relies very heavily for news coming through from Germany on Walter Baclou, who was such a good friend of Hitler that he went to Hitler's 50th birthday party. And on April the 18th, shortly before Hitler's 50th birthday party, he said he'd only just returned from Berlin, where he'd twice seen Ribbentrop, who he was convinced did not want a war, nor did other German officials. Baclou thinks we're on the wrong tack politically, that we're foolish to think war inevitable, etc. He then urges Alec Dunglass to get the Duke of Baclou in to see the Prime Minister to reassure him on all this. He said, Dunglass, with whom I'm becoming increasingly intimate, and I had a long confidential chat. I saw at once that I was being sounded out, and I gave an anti-Winston tirade. By all means, he must be kept out of the cabinet. I was aware that there is a movement afoot to give him the Admiralty, and I've warned Rab. I thought of my brief conversation with Walter Baclou and rang him up and begged him to come at once to the Foreign Office. He did, and I ushered him into Rab, and they had 40 minutes confidential talk. Rab later wrote out a memo of their conversation and showed one copy to the PM and the other to Halifax. The PM then sent for Walter via Mrs. Chamberlain, who talked to Molly, that's the Duchess, on the telephone. The PM kept Walter for an hour this evening and seized upon his report, which coincides with his own views. That's the supposition by Chips, by the way. We are back now on appeasement. Walter's visit has a great effect on Halifax. The Russian policy is now off, and we're trying to seek a way out of it, back to appeasement. From reading all the other papers about this period, it's quite clear that Chamberlain was not taken in by Walter Baclou, that although Chamberlain was still desperate at this stage to try and avoid a war, he didn't believe what Baclou said to him about no one in the Nazi higher ranks not wanting one. He thought that was nonsense. The next day, 20th of April, it was decided today, in view of Walter Baclou's information, to send back Neville Henderson to Berlin. He's leaving at once. It was a mistake to have him here so long. He'd been brought back after the annexation of Czechoslovakia. The diaries throughout the summer of 1939 are full of scare stories which emphasize just how bad Chips's information was, not culled from Foreign Office telegrams, which he was still reading, but culled from his aristocratic and royal friends in England and around Europe. His information is so bad that it's not until the 22nd of August 1939 he writes, "Sleepily I opened the newspaper and read emblazoned across the ever-sensational express, German-Russian pact. Then I realised that the Russians have double-crossed us, as I always believed they would. They've been coquetting secretly with Germany, even as our negotiations proceeded. They are the foulest people on earth." Well, times don't change. "They are nice to their fiendish type. Now it looks like a war," he at last realises 11 days before it breaks out, "and a possible partition of Poland. The Russians have not unnaturally decided that the Germans are the best bet, and even as our conversations continue, Ribbentrop is flying to Moscow to conclude their death pact. Even so, I refuse to be too pessimistic, but it seems like the end of our world. That is, if Russia and Germany really get together. But it seems that we shall regain Japan and possibly Italy." So he's wrong about that. "Oh, Anthony Eden, whose fault, of course, all this is, may you be forgiven." He paints a picture of the Foreign Office that last week before war breaks out as like a roller coaster. One moment, telegrams are coming in saying it's all over. The next minute, they're coming in saying it's all going to be fine. He does know about Diaries, the Swede, who tried to broker some sort of peace arrangement. He knows about him on the 28th of August, which of course is 2 days after the original set date for the invasion of Poland. And he says that Diaries is telling the Foreign Office that Goering is anxious to dethrone Hitler and set himself up, perhaps as a general monk, and restore the Hohenzollerns, etc. He says he doubts the validity of Diaries, as he calls him the walrus, of Diaries' credentials, but he's taken seriously by Halifax. A secret plane transported the two emissaries clandestinely here. The news got out, at least the arrival, but not the identity of the men. This foolish and melodramatic story is known to about 10 people, of course, of whom Chips is one. Special facilities were accorded them at the airport. None of us here completely lost hope that peace may be saved. Sadly, a few days later, it's all over. He says on 29th of August, in a magnificent demonstration of his foresight, "Things are looking up. There are accounts of the Hitler regime cracking, of the Nazi leaders quarrelling amongst themselves, of food shortages, etc. UK is up, and perhaps Neville will triumph. Viva Chamberlain." 2nd of September 1939 at 12:30, Alec Dunglass crossed over from number 10, and we talked secretly with Rab. Alec still thinks that the brand might be snatched from the burning fire. Some sort of démarche might be made through an intermediary, which would induce the Germans to retire from Poland, where the tempo of this half-hearted war increases slightly. Both the offensive and defensive are mild. When one reads the accounts of the savagery of the fighting on the first 2 or 3 days of the invasion of Poland, one sees just how accurate his understanding of the situation was. I'm going to end there, but there's a small postscript. He stayed at the Foreign Office until July 1941. Churchill, who he thought hated him, actually didn't hate him. I think he just didn't really notice him. And he therefore didn't kick him out in the way that he kicked out other people he thought were appeasers. You'll know the famous story about Sir Horace Wilson, Chamberlain's emissary to Hitler and general advisor. Churchill told somebody to tell Wilson that if he saw him in Downing Street again, he'd be the next High Commissioner to Greenland. And that didn't happen to Chips. And when Rab was made Education Minister in 1941, in July 1941, to go and do his excellent work on the 1944 Education Act, he offered to take Chips with him. And I think the allure of reading telegrams in the Ministry of Education, and instead of going to endless salons run by glamorous ambassadresses around London, but instead having lunch with headmasters and the odd vice-chancellor, didn't really appeal to Chips, so he resigned. Probably just as well, because a week before he resigned, and this is 3 weeks after Operation Barbarossa has been launched, he says, the Russian-German war fought on a large scale with many casualties on both sides, began 3 weeks ago today. Forecasts varied. It was thought, and he was one who thought them, that it would take Germany anything from a fortnight to 3 weeks to finish off the bear. Well, the bear hasn't been finished off, but he does write a week later, the day before he leaves the Foreign Office, The Russian-German war has gone on now for 4 weeks, and only now do the newspapers begin to refer to the battle for Moscow. Meanwhile, we have had a false peace, a dangerous lulling respite, and our doom may come in September. As I say, he is an object lesson in how to study sources. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. I've got a couple of questions to start us off, and then I'll open up to the rest of the audience. I wonder, could you say a little bit about what's in your version of the diaries that isn't in the original one? Because obviously this is a monumental work that you've executed, and in a sense you've got to reconstruct a text which has been Bowdlerized or expurgated. Can you tell us a bit about, how our view of Chips and our view of the kind of issues he was describing, how that changes in the light of the new evidence you've produced?
Yes. The original manuscript of the diaries is about 1.7 million words. It runs with 1 or 2 gaps from January 1918 to April 1957. Chips dies in 1958, but the last 18 months of his life, he doesn't go out very much. He's had a series of strokes, and hasn't lost the will to live, far from it, but he's lost the will to keep a diary. He isn't doing very much. The original publication of the diaries, edited by Robert Rhodes James, happened in the autumn of 1967. At that stage, there were only 1.3 million words of the diaries extant. That's not because Chips wrote from beyond the grave, but because there were apparently no diaries after 1952. And in about 1990, a man knocked on the door at Kelvedon to see Paul Channon and gave him a couple of carrier bags and said, "I think these belong to you." And he had bought at a car boot sale in Essex, which is where all the best historical documents are to be found. He'd bought at a car boot sale in Essex the manuscripts of the diaries from 1952 to 1957. So I had, in any case, a bigger manuscript to work on. But it's important to say that Rhodes James, and I knew Robert quite well, and I liked him, and certainly in his early days he was a very good historian. I still think he wrote one of the best books ever written on Churchill, which is A Study in Failure. And his Life of Rosebery, although it's been overtaken by Leo McKinstry's, I think, was a very, very fine book indeed, which he wrote when he was quite a young man. But Robert agreed to edit the diaries. He agreed with Peter Coates, who was Chips's partner, and I think was left the diaries as a form of a pension. He agreed to edit them without ever seeing the original manuscript, which is quite astonishing. Coates and a secretary sat down for about 5 years and went through the diaries and took out the best part of 1.25 million words and gave him, well, actually a bit less than that because the last years weren't available, but they took out about 4/5 of what was in the original manuscript. And this was largely because so much of it referred either to Chips's private life or to the private lives of others who were still alive. Chips, in his will, said that he didn't want the diaries published in an unexpurgated form until he'd been dead for 60 years, and he died in 1958, so I started the project in late 2018. And this was partly to avoid libel, although usually when he's incredibly offensive about somebody or says they've done something beastly with somebody else's wife or somebody else's husband in many cases, it turns out to be true. Coates was determined also to protect himself, because at the time in the early 60s when he was making the edit, it would have outed him as homosexual at a time when homosexuality was illegal. So he had to be very careful. When I've seen the original proofs of the diaries, they're slightly longer than what was published. The 1967 edition is about 230,000 words. The original proofs are about 250,000. They were shown to Chips's ex-wife, Lady Honor, who by that stage had remarried. And she took out a lot of references to political events, notably to Churchill, about whom he's constantly offensive. He really doesn't like Churchill, which I don't need to tell you this as a historian of the 30s was a quite common view in the Conservative Party. But she thought it would damage Paul's career. Churchill had only just died when she was reading the proofs. This was 1966. And she was very worried it would have damage. And also Coates went out of his way to tone down any approval of Hitler or the Nazis. I mean, Chips says again and again in the 30s, and I made one reference to it in my presentation, that he sees the Soviet Union as the bulwark, he sees the Nazis as the bulwark against the Soviet Union's attempt to extend Bolshevism across the continent of Europe. And he's totally at a loss to see why people are upset with Hitler for doing that. And none of that turns up in the original diaries. So what we learn from these diaries, which I would say this wouldn't I think are a very great historical document, what we learn from them is that Chips was one of those many people who couldn't see what all the fuss was about with the Nazis were concerned, I mean, right up really until war is declared, and had this tremendous fear and loathing of Bolshevism, which of course was shared by Neville Chamberlain and was the reason why Chamberlain didn't engage the Russians before the summer of 1939 in any sort of conversation about how they might stop Hitler.
So it's not surprising to hear that he was favourable to Hitler on the grounds of his anti-Bolshevism, but I was intrigued to hear from you that he approved of the more, for want of a better word, socialistic or community-oriented aspects of National Socialism. So you mentioned his enthusiasm for Wurst and, healthy walking and living together, all things that I wouldn't really associate with him. Yeah. Isn't that a bit of a contradiction?
I think he was, I say, something of a racial supremacist. And I think he thought that the Anglo-Saxons on this island were squandering what he thought was their racial supremacy. There's something very similar in a letter that I read from Lord Northcliffe to his editor on the Daily Mail in about 1909. Northcliffe used to get in a car and drive around Germany in the summers in Edwardian times, and would constantly write back saying the Germans they look healthier than us, they look taller and fitter and stronger than us, they work harder than us, they've got newer and better factories than us, they're less decadent than we are. And this is why Northcliffe was so afraid of Germany starting a war in which we would be crushed. And Chips, I don't think I'd ever read those letters from Northcliffe, obviously, but I think Chips had very much the same view, that we had become a degenerate people. And I don't think he'd have viewed it as socialistic means. I think he'd have thought that it was just a good campaign for, I use a ghastly phrase, national health and efficiency, that they should, that the British people of that era should perk up. And of course, we remember before the Great War, very large quantities of people who went for medicals, to join up in 1899 in the Second Boer War, were rejected for health reasons. They had to introduce bantam regiments for people men who were only 5 feet tall to fight in the Great War. And although some sort of welfare state got going from 1911, and there was physical fitness taught in schools, I mean, right the way, I think, from about 1902, I think there was a Balfour Education Act that started that. It was very much at the forefront of Chips's mind that when he went to his constituency or went around the country and saw particularly the industrial working classes, they looked pretty pasty. And he was worried about what was going to mean for the national spirit.
Yes, so that I understand. The only thing I wondered about was the references made to his approval of the mixing of the classes, that sort of commonality, which one would not otherwise have associated.
Yes, I don't think he seriously wanted that to happen in this country.
Right.
I think it was a perfectly good. And we don't forget, Germany had been defeated in a war less than 20 years earlier and had to pick itself up and start again. And I think that's what really impressed him. I mean, never mind the hideous methods that Hitler used. I think Chips was impressed that Germany had, from a standing start and from pretty much annihilation and bankruptcy, had picked itself up and was now the most feared power in Europe.
Thank you. So I've got many other questions, but I'm going to hold back for now and open up to the room. If you could just give your name and your affiliation, if you have one, that would be terrific.
John Freeman, I look forward to that. This is my question. But thank you very much. I enjoyed the diaries. I've read 2 more, it's not the third. One of the things that comes across what you said this afternoon is how many things he got wrong, which you've emphasised many, many times.
Yeah.
And he was, I must say, as a reader, I found him a ghastly man, horribly vindictive, always picking on officials, ministers and others, trying to do them down.
Yeah.
I mean, a really nasty little creeper around the corners. But
Many people share that view.
notwithstanding what you said, one thing I'm really not, who took him seriously about anything? I mean, he comes across as a bit of a joke.
I've asked myself that question. I was minded, I thought about this morning when I read with great sadness the obituaries of Philip Ziegler, and the Times obituary noted that when Ziegler was writing his life of Mountbatten, he found Mountbatten so unpleasant that he had to put a note on his desk saying, remember when all is said and done, he was still a great man. I couldn't put such notice on my desk about Chips, but I coped with it because Chips was immensely entertaining as a writer. This was my lockdown project. I was going to spend 5 years doing this, and because I was under house arrest, as we all were, and I wasn't going to parties in Downing Street every evening, I had plenty of time to do this, and it was a wonderful thing to have to do at that very grim passage in our national life. And he writes terrifically. He would have been a brilliant journalist. One of the things that Chips had going for him was that when he went into a room at some sort of gathering, a reception or a cocktail party or a dinner, he had the knack of finding the most interesting person there and getting to say something interesting and then putting it in his diary. And that's why they're so good. Even if you look at the Rhodes James edition, I don't want to run Robert down because he's not here to defend himself, but Robert even makes Chips quite fascinating given the limited material he had because of the people that Chips knows and the way he reports them rather than necessarily the content of what they say. But who took him seriously? I told you the story about Rab. He wanted a restaurant car on his train. Chips made himself popular, and I think we've all been in institutions where the people who run them are slightly taken in by the popular boys or girls, and they get various favours until they show that they're not really up to it. And Chips himself realised this. I made a joke about why he didn't stay on with Rab, but he knew, having been a PPS at that stage for 3.5 years, and with Churchill in power, he was never going to get a ministerial job. He was never going to become even Under-Secretary at the Ministry of Agriculture. And he recognised that and thought, well, I'll just go off and spend the rest of my war having dinner at the Connaught, where everything is or Claridge's, where everything is rationed by price, and therefore I can live in pre-war style. And that's what he did. He was held in affection. Chamberlain, for whom actually I have a very high regard, Chamberlain held him in great affection and thought he was doing his best. But Chamberlain was under no illusions about him. That's why he never promoted him. But I think that they all felt that he just about found his niche. He was extraordinarily lucky to be in such an important department in a great office of state, like the Foreign Office, rather than be kicked off to be, helping out the Postmaster General, which would probably have been more equal to his talents. And it's lucky for us he was kicked off there because, he does again and again, as you've seen as you've read the diaries, he does say things that are interesting and will be of interest to generations of historians to come.
Thank you. Next question, please.
I have Dan Larson, Trinity. I have a couple of questions. First, I wanted to ask you about, because Chips has access to a lot of information. It doesn't seem to use it very well. And
exactly
so my
right,
question
Dan.
is, do you put that down to a kind of lack of innate ability and intelligence? Or is there just something fundamentally flawed about how he processes and uses information that the rest of us can learn from?
I think it's a bit of both. I'm reluctant to sort of make that insult that university men and women occasionally make about people who have not had their privileges of saying he'd never been properly educated. But he never went to a university, he'd never been taught the art of independent thought or sifting information and looking at it and making his mind up about it himself. So he started at that disadvantage. Mind you, so did many other people in high office in those days. And Rab Butler, who was a highly educated man, and of course ended up as master of York College in the 1960s, he got a lot of things wrong as well. But Chips was uncanny in his inability to process. And I think part of it was just down to straightforward prejudice, that he knew what he believed in and he liked to take the facts to fit his theories rather than the other way around. I think that was the main problem. I think he did lack an ability to process information, but I think he was always looking for a means of justifying his own views. And he starts off being, you know, very keen to avoid war with the Germans, as I say, not because he has any real experience of the Great War and he saw the horrors of that war and didn't want another one, which was a perfectly respectable pacifist position in this country right the way through the 30s. But it's because, as I say, he wanted to stop the Russians. He had this fear of the Russians. He did have a lot of friends, again, aristocrats and royalty, in the Russian diaspora. He had a pet Grand Duchess living in a hut on the Isle of Wight to whom he paid a pension and used to go around and visit her occasionally and tap her on the head. And you know, he'd heard all these stories about the terrible things the Bolsheviks did. And you know, when he goes to the Olympic Games, it's only 18 years since the Tsar and his family have been machine gunned in their cellar in Yekaterinburg. So it's pretty modern history at that stage, and pretty recent history. And so that motivates him. But I'd be reluctant to say he wasn't a clever man, because he's exceptionally well read. That comes out in the diaries. He's a very elusive writer. He's read an awful lot of books, and not just in the English language. He's a great reader of French literature and, of course, American literature, even though he hates America. And he's a tremendous expert on fine art and antiques. So he has got an intellectual side to him. He just doesn't seem to crank it up and apply it to this. It is, as I say, like being in a soap opera. I think he is like a small boy who's got into a sweet shop and has been told he can have as much as he can gorge himself on. And he never really gets over the excitement of being a big boy, because he's an outsider in a very outside way. He's come from a foreign country. He only becomes a British subject in 1933, the day before he gets married. And it's only when he marries Honor and has become a British subject that Lady Ivor is able to ask him, she's dying to get out of Southend, she's had enough. She can now say to him, well, look, Chips, you can be my successor. Now you're British. And so it's, you know, you put yourself in the place of someone who becomes an American citizen and suddenly finds him or herself in the White House, you know, working in a junior capacity. You know, it'd be rather overwhelming. And I think it would be very exciting as well. And I don't think that he ever got over that excitement. And that, I think, also stopped him being as objective as he should have been about things.
Thank you. Next question. Yes.
Robert Tombs, St John's. I just wondered, you mentioned his very great esteem for Chamberlain. Chips is a snob, as he made very clear. He hated Churchill, though Churchill was the son of a duke, and also, of course, a friend of Edward VIII.
Yeah.
And yet he loved Chamberlain, although Chamberlain was the son of a Birmingham screw manufacturer. Was that just because their views fitted his own prejudices, or were there other personal things involved?
He invites Churchill to a huge party, again for 400 people, all Chips's parties are for 400 people, that he gives on the night of the coronation in 1937. So they weren't complete enemies, but he is very rude about him all the time. But he is very keen to suck up to important people. And he knows that Churchill, although he thinks Churchill's political career is in the past, Churchill is a great celebrity in 1937. He's writing in the Daily Telegraph every week, so he must be a celebrity. Professor Tombs is often to be seen with great distinction in that paper, as you know. And so he's very glad to have him there. But yes, do these people coincide with my opinions? And I mean, Chips is not consistent. I mean, Chips says some absolutely abominable things about Jews. And yet, when Leslie Hoare-Belisha gets thrown out of the War Office in January 1940, his only offence is that he is a Jew. Chips, who has befriended him before that, goes to his aid, supports him, gives him lunch, gives him dinner, tries to persuade his friends in the whip's office to get him an offer of a better job. He was offered the Board of Trade and thought it was an insult. And indeed, I don't blame poor Belisha for, I mean, as you know, it's in the footnotes in Volume 2, a man called General Pownall, who was Lord Gort's right-hand man, wrote to Chamberlain and said, you can't expect a gentleman like Lord Gort to take orders from a ghastly Jew boy like poor Belisha. I mean, it's a really horrible piece of anti-Semitism. And Chamberlain realised he couldn't afford to lose Gort. He could more easily find a new Secretary of State for War than he could find a new C&C. And so Belisha had to go. And Chips is horrified by this treatment of Belisha and comes in and embraces him. So, yes, he has prejudices. Some of them are pretty repulsive. And he is a snob. But if people show him kindness, as Neville Chamberlain did, then I think that's fine. By his point of view, also, of course, as an outsider, he sees Neville Chamberlain as this man who's not only Prime Minister, but whose elder brother was leader of the Conservative Party, or half-brother, and whose father was one of the most legendary politicians of the late Victorian era. And so as far as he's concerned, he's got pedigree. And similarly, you know, he doesn't like Baldwin that much, but he admires Baldwin, and he's nice about Baldwin, who is the son of a Worcestershire ironmaster. So if they've got status, that's different. And he does eventually befriend people in the Labour Party, but usually those who share some of his more loose habits.
So we've got time for one more question, I think. Please.
Simon, thank you for a fantastic talk.
If you could just say who you are.
Sorry, no, Garnet Money from Derby College. Thanks, Simon. Fantastic talk.
Thank you.
Vividly illustrating the man. What do we know about his diary writing habits? Was he a daily recorder? Did diaries have lots of crossings out in corrections?
I've seen all the manuscripts, and he's a very fluent writer. There are crossings out, of course, and his spelling gets better as he gets older. Maybe that's true of all of us. But he tended to write it last thing at night, or if he was partying until 3 o'clock in the morning, he'd write it the following morning. He tries to keep one most days. And, you know, for those very busy years, 39, 40, 41, he writes something like 120,000 words a year. I mean, this is really serious diary keeping. And he occasionally gives himself away in that he'll talk about an event that happened today, and the date will be, if you look it up on the historical record, the day will be the day after it happened. So we know he didn't always do it then. There are two other points about his diary writing. He seemed to be concerned to write for himself privately rather than for an audience. And I was waiting. I didn't read ahead when I read the diaries. I edited them as I read them, so that it was as much a revelation to me as it is to my readers. I knew how they would absorb them as they read them. And I get to, I think it's 1937, he goes to a Gordy at Oxford, at Christ Church, at his old college. And some chap sits opposite him and says, "Gosh, Channon, you know everybody. I bet if you keep a diary, it's jolly good." And Chips, who has never admitted even to his wife that he keeps a diary, because he's terrified of it being found, because he is so bloody rude about people in it. He's had a few drinks, and he says, "Well, actually, I do keep a diary." And I thought to myself, "Oh, God, Chips, why have you said that?" And he then says, he goes for a walk around Oxford the next day, and he says, "You know, what's his name is right. My diaries might be rather good." He said, "I think I'm going to deposit them in the British Museum when I die, and I think they'll be quite interesting to later generations." So I then put my head in my hands again, and I thought, oh God, what he's going to do now is write for an audience, rather than have the sort of intimate confessional that we've had for the last, getting on for 20 years. Not a bit of it. The tone becomes, if anything, even more scabrous and even more revelatory after that. It's as if he's saying, "I'll be dead, I couldn't care less." Which, I mean, luckily for us, we've ended up with these, you know, fascinating diaries. And if he'd taken a different view, they'd be utterly boring. The other thing that is important to note about the diaries is there are gaps in them. There is no diary between when he turns up in England on New Year's Eve 1918 until New Year's Day 1923. And I'm absolutely sure in my own mind, I could bore you for hours with my evidence for this, that they existed and they were destroyed because he, I think, got up to a lot of exciting things at Oxford, which were then illegal. And he admits in about 1947 he'd had a homosexual affair with Prince Paul of Yugoslavia. And I imagine quite a lot of that was in those diaries because that's where they met. And there's no suggestion of it at any other time. And so I think he thought he'd better just or somebody, maybe Coates, thought they better be destroyed in order to protect the not so innocent. He also stops keeping diaries when he has some great emotional upheaval. He falls in love in the 20s, although I don't think it was ever consummated, with Lord Gage, with whom he shares a flat in St James's. And when Gage decides to get married, and he decides to marry the daughter of Lady Desborough, and Lady Desborough is one of Chips's great hate figures for reasons I never quite got to the bottom of, then Chips just casts him to outer darkness. And he doesn't keep a diary after Gage says he's getting married, which is in early 1929. And he goes to America to see his parents. Now, you know that Chips is in a desperate state when he A, goes to America and B, goes to see his parents, because they are the two things he likes doing least of all in life. And it was probably because he needed more money. But he stays there for quite a long time. And I've seen the telegram that was sent to him by Lord Gage saying, Chips, for God's sake, please come back and be my best man. And apparently he did come back and was Gage's best man with very little grace and with as much charmlessness as possible. And the diaries don't begin again until February 1934. And I don't think he ever did keep a diary. It was in those years that he wrote his two novels, one of which is quite good. I haven't read the other one. And his history of the Wittelsbachs, the Ludwigs of Bavaria. So he was busy. And then the diary disappears in I think it's the second half of 1946 from memory. And this is when he's having an affair with Terence Rattigan and Peter Coates, who is effectively his wife by this stage. That's how we would now regard him, or husband, call it what you will. Peter Coates, who has had a very good war. He's been, first of all, Chief of Staff and then ADC to Lord Wavell, who is the penultimate Viceroy of India. He comes back from India with Wavell at the end of 1946, and there is what I believe the young generation would term a bitch fight between Coates and Rattigan. And the diaries are just, a whole volume has just disappeared. And I live in hope that someday there'll be a knock on the door at Kelvedon where his grandson's widow still lives, with a man from a car boot sale with those diaries in a couple of plastic bags. Because I'd love to do an expanded edition, even though they're quite big already. I'd love to do an expanded edition with those in. So that's how the diary works. And so if any of you know anybody who's got a Channon manuscript lying around, please do feel free to get in touch.
Well, Simon, mention of Gordy reminds me that I have to whisk you off in a minute to your reward. But before that, I'd like to do two things. First of all, to remind you to stay tuned to the Centre for Geopolitics. Our next meeting is on the 7th of March with former Prime Minister of Malta, Lawrence Gonzi, speaking on Britain and the Central Mediterranean. And that will be at Sydney, Sussex College at 5:30 in the Knox showroom. So 7th of March, 17:30. But the second thing I'd like to do, Simon, is to thank you very much indeed for restoring to his full infamy, as it were, a figure who may not have been important in his own right, but as a chronicler and a commentator seems to have been unsurpassed, and certainly an extremely good read. And we're very grateful to you for coming and sharing that work of restoration with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for asking.